Hey, how's it going everyone? Today, I have a matchup that I think is genuinely interesting to talk about because it challenges the idea that characters from overall stronger verses will always win against characters from overall weaker verses, regardless of the matchup. As I've mentioned before, one should look at the matchup and not the verse, especially if there's a lot of context and nuance that could surround it. Before we begin, I'd like to promote my Discord server, which you can gain access to by joining my Ko-Fi or by becoming a YouTube member. I'm trying to make this a platform where we can promote healthy power scaling, and I want to give a voice to the community. If you're interested in debating, or simply want to talk about how absolutely insane your favorite verses are, then you may want to consider joining. We accept any and all crazy takes, especially since power scaling is just for fun. The first thing I want to mention before we actually go into the scaling is that this is a matchup specifically between EMS Madara and True Form Sukuna. I want to give you guys the exact parameters for the matchup first, so that there's no misunderstanding for what exactly I'm trying to argue. I'm not giving Madara Kurama since he only used it in a single fight against Hashirama and basically captured the Nine Tails at some point before the fight began. I've also never really considered Kurama as part of Madara's arsenal to begin with. As for Sukuna, he won't have the 10 shadows, which means no Maharaga. However, this will be the same version that fought Genjutsu High after Gojo's death. Both Sukuna and Madara will have their special weapons, the Kumatoke and the Uchiha Gunbai respectively, although I don't think the weapons will play a major factor for a few reasons I'll get into later. Both villains will be in character, and it actually does play a major role in this specific matchup. Finally, Madara won't have the transcription seal Izanagi. He specifically set up this jutsu before his final fight with Hashirama so that he could bring himself back to life if he ever lost by sacrificing his right eye after certain conditions were met. The reason why I'm not giving him this jutsu is because the conditions can't be met. This doesn't mean that Madara can't or won't be using Izanagi, he just needs to activate the jutsu prior to any possible death. As always, there won't be any verse equalization, and one last thing I would like to ask from each and every one of you is to hear me out with every single point that I make, because I often see too many comments where people try to debate points that I've already tackled in the video. So with all that out of the way, let's begin. To start things off, for the sake of the video, I will completely concede to the idea that Sukuna loses to any version of Madara besides EMS. This includes Edo, One-Eyed Rinnegan Sage Mode, and especially Ten Tails. Any techniques or abilities that apply to any of those versions of Madara that I mentioned before will not be taken into account. Here is a list of all the jutsu that Madara has performed throughout both the manga and anime, and if you limit it only to the jutsu that EMS Madara should be capable of, the list shortens quite a bit. One should really consider that Madara's arsenal isn't as versatile without the Rinnegan or Hashirama cells, since most of his offensive jutsu are either fire-style techniques or rely on the Susanoo. Furthermore, things like Genjutsu wouldn't work since there's no verse equalization. Since Sukuna doesn't have chakra, Madara can't place him under Genjutsu, and I've seen plenty of arguments in my comment sections where people have brought up that he could inject his chakra into his opponent's eyes, but how would the chakra flow without a chakra network? The chakra network is a pathway system that's intertwined with every organ in the body, which carries chakra produced from their organs and cells. I've also seen people bring up how Madara can place tailed beasts under Genjutsu even though it isn't stated that they have chakra networks, but the tailed beasts are entirely composed of chakra, and we know that Kurama does have internal organs, because the Gold and Silver brothers ate portions of his organs in order to survive for the 2 weeks after he swallowed them. Unless it's the main focus of a scene or panel, we never really see the chakra network intertwined with all of the organs. Kakashi states that even for his Sharingan, the Tenketsu or chakra points are undetectable. Only a Byakugan can see them clearly. He also says they're no larger than a prick of a pin, and whenever we see the chakra points, they're about the same size as the network itself, so the network should be extremely thin. I don't think it's disingenuous to also assume that the tailed beasts would also have a chakra network, especially since we don't actually see Kurama's internal organs anyway. I know there are a lot of people that get upset because they believe that I'm taking away such an integral part of Madara's arsenal, but that would mean that I have to give Sukuna an entire organ just so one of Madara's abilities can work. Just to be clear, Genjutsu is not that important to Madara's overall toolkit. He uses it twice during the war, once against a random shinobi and the second time against the Raikage. He really doesn't use Genjutsu that often, and to make things more evident, he doesn't actually have any named Genjutsu. Even on his jutsu list, it's only stated as Sharingan Genjutsu. He's not as reliant on it as someone like Itachi or even Sasuke, so I don't think not equalizing the verses is unfair. After all, I'm not gonna give Madara Cursed Energy just so Sukuna always knows the inception of his attacks thanks to Cursed Energy Sparks. No verse equalization keeps things fair and simple. Now moving on to the win conditions, Sukuna has to kill Madara in whatever way he can, however he'll potentially have to do it 3 times since Madara would have access to Izanagi, which I'll talk about later. As for Madara, he can't just stab Sukuna or burn him down since he has RCT. He'll have to destroy Sukuna's entire body or a large enough portion that Sukuna can't heal himself with RCT. Let's get into speed. I've gotten a lot of comments throughout many of my videos regarding Naruto characters because the light speed meta is quite inconsistent. Almost every single statement that implies or promotes a light speed meta comes from the databooks, which are a whole can of worms in of themselves. Because the databooks have a few statements that seem hyperbolic at face value, many question their validity. It's all about interpretation, and you can get some crazy scaling if you take things at face value, like with the Naruto universal meta. Now, for the most part, I think I've been fair when it comes to the interpretations I've gotten from the databooks, since I don't think most characters scratch light speed movement speed, and yet I still give them light speed scaling in my videos. One of which is the Raikage. You can read through the entire story 3 times front and back and barely find any statements that imply any characters are verbatim light speed with a feat to back it up. The Raikage, who is the fastest shinobi in the world, only has one statement that implies he's light speed, and it comes directly from the databooks. In the English translation, the statement says he rushes at almost the speed of light. In the Japanese translation, it says light like speed. However, it uses the term gotoki, which is normally used in simile kanji, which means it's not a direct comparison. If you ask me, the Raikage is not light speed, but like always, I still grant him light speed in my videos for the sake of fairness. I'm only granting him light speed movement speed when it comes to his version 2 lightning cloak. There's a very important reason as to why I have to go into this whole side tangent about Naruto lightspeed meta, and it's because Madara never dodges any lightspeed attack. Yeah, you heard me. You can look at every single fight and every single concrete lightspeed interaction that Edo Madara and One-Eyed Sage Madara have, and in every single one of these interactions, he never dodges a lightspeed attack. EMS Madara has only ever been in a single fight, and there are no concrete lightspeed feats in Hashirama vs Madara. Now, to be clear, he does react to these attacks, and he can even block them, but he can't move his entire body out of the way, or at least he never shows the clear capacity to do so. The reason why I brought up Edo Madara is because this is the closest version of Madara to EMS that has the most substantial feats. I'm aware that Edo Tensei reanimates the body to be weaker than when they were alive, but we don't know exactly how much weaker they are comparatively. When revived by Orochimaru's new and improved Edo Tensei, Tobirama states that he was revived at close to their original power. Kabuto also states that Madara's Edo Tensei body is special, and that he brought him back stronger than when he was alive. However, he never actually knew how strong Madara truly was. Hashirama contradicts this, since he did state that Madara was regaining his past power when he was brought back to life, but again, the difference is never quantified, and we only got a chance to see this alive but blind version of Madara perform a single feat before he got Sage Mode, which would have amped him considerably. In addition, one should consider that if Edo Madara really was weaker than his alive self, he certainly had a much stronger arsenal with both the Rinnegan and the wood style he gained from his new Hashirama cells. Whether or not he's weaker, I don't think one can deny that having one of the most busted nature transformations and the strongest dojutsu in addition to an immortal body would help at least somewhat balance the scales. Now, I don't want to make an exact comparison between this revived Madara and his EMS version because revived Madara did have Hashirama cells. One of the comments in my previous video mentioned that Hashirama cells don't amp one's physical stats, so I did some research. According to Obito, Danzo implanted himself with Hashirama cells in order to increase his physical energy. Chakra is composed of both physical and mental energy, so when one of these is improved, one's chakra becomes more powerful, which I believe would include their capability to enhance themselves with chakra. This version of Blind Madara was capable of blitzing Sage Mode Naruto and Sai before he stole Hashirama's Senjutsu chakra. Sage Mode is stated by Naruto to have a wider danger sense than KCM, and he also says it's faster. I'm not exactly sure what he means by faster because all of Naruto's best speed feats come from KCM and KCM2, like when he dodged A's top speed punch. I think when he refers to it as faster, he meant it in terms of his reaction speed. Madara did knock both him and Sai away, but unlike Sai, Naruto did block the hit with his arms. All of this is just to say that I don't think alive Madara with Hashirama cells was moving at light speed in order to knock away Naruto, but even in the event that he did move at light speed, Madara is being amped by Hashirama cells, which EMS Madara wouldn't have. I know to some of you it sounds like I'm downplaying Madara's speed, but like I said, you could look through all of his fights during the war and easily come to the conclusion that he never dodges a single attack that could be interpreted as light speed, and he's never stated or shown to be faster than the Raikage, whose top speed I've already agreed to with being light speed. Does that mean Madara has no light speed feats? No, he does have quite a few light speed reaction feats and possible combat speed feats. During his fight against the 5 Kage, Madara blocks a kick from Tsunade, who teleported to the battlefield alongside A at the speed of light. One thing I would like to add is that Tsunade didn't use the full extent of the 100 healings technique. He blocks the Raikage's attempt at a blitz, and when A and Inoki team up with the Light and Boulder Jutsu, he gets blitzed from behind. He does grab A later on during their fight against the Wood clone Susanoo, but this isn't exactly a speed feat on his end since A was distracted by Tsunade's sudden lapse mid-combat. As he fights the Shinobi Alliance, he also blocks a barrage of laser circus beams that are stated to be light speed in the databook, or more so, they're stated to be lasers, which people interpret as light speed. He does fight KCM2 Naruto, and while a majority of their fight does boil down to Wood style versus the Ninetales, there is one specific feat here that may or may not be interpreted as light speed depending on how you see the interaction. After a short chat, Naruto's clone is seen falling from the sky towards Madara with a mini-tailed beast bomb in hand. Madara puts up his Gunbai and reflects the attack back at the clone. I'll be honest, I hate this interaction because both the anime and manga don't do a very good job at displaying how fast the clone is traveling, nor is it displayed how exactly he got up there in the first place, which, believe it or not, does matter. I have no idea how much faster KCM2 is over KCM. As far as I'm aware, there aren't any statements that could be used to interpret a possible amp for KCM2, so I can't tell you if it's a 10 times amp, a 2 times amp, or a 1000 times amp over its previous form. Now, someone who's just looking at this without thinking about it too hard would say Naruto's clone should be logically charging at Madara at full speed. And to an extent, I would agree. However, later on in the war arc, Madara gets revived and gains Hashirama's Sage Mode, which for the sake of simplicity, we're just gonna say is as big of an amp as Naruto's Sage Mode, especially since it's never been stated to be stronger. He gets hard blitzed by KCM2 Naruto. He has a danger sense and all-around improved stats because of both Sage Mode and his revived body, and he still gets tagged by Naruto. Sage Mode can be quantified to be at the very least a 10 times amp because Jirobo stated that the version 2 Curse Mark transformation made him 10 times stronger, and both transformations are reliant on nature energy. An allegedly stronger version of Madara with a possible 10 times amp still gets tagged by KCM2 Naruto. This is what I meant when I said that Naruto's light speed meta is kind of inconsistent, and don't even get me started on the Light Fang. Ten Tails Madara's fastest quantifiable jutsu also being stated to be only light speed. My issue with this particular feat is simply that I don't think this clone is falling at light speed, let alone faster than light speeds. The clone is only seen falling towards Madara. There's no prior movement shown, so one can't really argue that he ran at top speed before he jumped. He looks up and sees the clone is falling down in his direction. I'm just not convinced this particular feat is a light speed feat, let alone an FTL feat, since Naruto's clone is only falling. The general conclusion one could at least come to is that Naruto's clone only jumped up into the air. Now, every other speed feat that he has comes from his one-eyed Rinnegan version or his Ten Tails forms, which I've already said Sukuna can't beat. As for his fight against Hashirama, we only get to see 2 short parts of the fight, when he's using the Ninetales and when he loses, neither of which show any speed feats that are definitively light speed. I'm also aware that Madara states having Hashirama cells may cause him to fight with less refinement, which could be interpreted to mean he's less likely to dodge. However, without any actual feats to support the idea that he would have dodged all those at light speed attacks, I don't think I can comfortably say whether or not it would be the case. So to wrap up Madara's end of the speed section, I do believe he has consistent light speed reaction time and combat speed. I don't think he can run at the speed of light or dodge light speed attacks due to a lack of evidence. However, he can also form a Susanoo body at light speed, since both Sasuke and Itachi were able to block light speed attacks with them. With all of that being said, for the sake of fairness, I will at the very least grant him light speed movement speed as well. So overall, all of Madara's speed stats should be within the realm of light speed bare minimum. Before I get into JJK speed scaling, I need to talk about a specific statement that has essentially made people think JJK caps out at supersonic speeds. That statement being Cursed Naoya reaching Mach 3. To give you all an idea of how fast an object traveling at massively hypersonic speed is, by comparison, lightning travels at approximately Mach 874,030. That is a massive difference. However, JJK characters like Maki and Hakari have already displayed the ability to react to and partially dodge or block lightning. One should really look at the context of these feats and statements, because while Naoya did reach Mach 3 and did overwhelm Maki, she was mentally nerfed, and once she fully realized her potential, she could easily keep up with him and evade all of his attacks. I could go into a whole tangent about Hakari's reaction feat against Kashimo's lightning, or Maki blocking Sukuna's Nue lightning in the official volume release, but none of it matters because Sukuna outscales every single other person in the verse, besides Gojo, to such a massive extent that only feats that pertain to him specifically matter. The most important of which is his EM Wave evasion feat. I've gone over this feat in 2 of my other videos already, but the gist is that Kashimo fired an EM Wave attack at Sukuna at point blank range. Electromagnetic waves travel at 99.93% the speed of light in an atmosphere, so this attack was borderline light speed with a negligible difference. Sukuna's body was heavily damaged by the impromptu hollow purple, so half of his face was destroyed, his arm was missing, and his RCT was healing his body at a relatively slow rate. Not only did he perform this feat with a damaged body, but while he's still utilizing Megumi's form. According to Gojo, one of Miguel's advantages over Japanese sorcerers when it comes to cursed energy reinforcement is his physique and muscle mass. He says the result is pretty menacing, and if both Miguel and himself were to go at it with only cursed energy reinforcement, Gojo would win the sprint, but Miguel would win the marathon. Sukuna's true form is not only larger by comparison even to Miguel, but he's got an extra pair of arms and a second mouth, which give him a frightening advantage when it comes to combat. I'm not gonna give you some random calc or possible amp for how fast Sukuna could be in his true form. However, if his larger build benefits more from cursed energy reinforcement, then I think it's at the very least fair to say that Sukuna would easily have light speed reaction time and movement speed in short bursts, especially if he's fighting in his top condition. A couple of more things to add are that while fighting Maki, he sends her flying through a building and moves so fast he's ready to intercept her. He also moves so fast on panel that he disappears as her attack approaches him and grabs her face without her being able to react. Finally, after ramping himself up with his third Black Flash, he moves faster than his own slashes. Now, combat speed is a bit harder to prove because it depends on 2 things, both of which involve Kashimo, the God of Lightning. Prior to his CT mythical beast Amber, Kashimo could send out bolts of electricity which he calls lightning thanks to his cursed energy trait. When he activates his CT, the narrator specifies that his body has surpassed human limits. Therefore, Kashimo's body should be stronger and faster than Hakari, Maki, and Toji, who all have massively hypersonic reaction time. Sukuna not only blitzed Kashimo after he used Kumatoke to attack him with a torrent of lightning, but completely overpowered him in a single exchange. He slams him into the ground, throws him away, and sends out slashes that are so fast, Kashimo, who is still facing Sukuna's direction, can't even launch an attack. Depending on how you interpret this interaction, you could say that Kashimo gave up as soon as he saw the flying slashes, but I don't agree with this interpretation, especially since you can see that Kashimo's arm is readying up for another attack as he's flying away, and the slashes were already traveling in his direction before he could even react. This is also a good way to at least get a ballpark for the speed of his slashes, since Kashimo did surpass the human realm, and we know that the stronger sorcerers can at least react to lightning. His slashes therefore could be faster than lightning bare minimum. Now, the second feat that we can use to figure out Sukuna's combat speed entirely relies on interpretation. Kashimo charged up and fired this beam of energy from his hands at Sukuna. I can't tell you what electrical phenomena this attack is composed of. However, if this attack is made up of EM waves or is as fast as his EM wave attack, then Sukuna should be capable of chanting and firing his world-cutting slash at light speed or faster than light speeds, since it not only cut Kashimo's arm off, but the attack was fired after the beam was already traveling towards Sukuna, and the world-cutting slash both traveled farther and destroyed the beam. It may be easier to interpret what the properties of the beam are once we get the anime adaptation, but there isn't that much evidence that implies how fast this attack is and what exactly it's composed of. That means you either think the beam is light speed, it's slower than light, or it's faster than light if you think it's Kashimo's strongest and fastest attack. I'll go with the middle ground interpretation and say that it's at least as fast as his EM wave attack, which would mean Sukuna can easily chant and fire the slash while a borderline light speed attack approaches him, comfortably putting his world-cutting slash at light speed, and for the sake of simplicity, we'll say his dismantle slashes are slower than his world-cutting slash, so they should be anywhere between faster than lightning and relativistic, since like the world-cutting slash, Kashimo couldn't react to his dismantles. This would also be consistent with Sukuna outpacing his own slashes after landing a few black flashes. So like Madara, Sukuna would have light speed reaction time, combat speed, and movement speed. I genuinely believe these two are at least relative to each other in terms of speed. The fact that Naruto characters don't have any statements for their speed amps makes it very difficult to just assume that Madara is anything faster than light, because all of the statements from the databooks imply light speed at best. Meanwhile, JJK's speed scaling skyrockets in the final arc because Sukuna just so happened to fight a person who launched an attack that is at the very worst 99.93% the speed of light while he was in a weakened state. So now that we have a ballpark for these two in terms of speed, let's move on to durability. When it comes to durability, but more so endurance, Sukuna is an absolute monster. For anyone that's watched Naruto only, RCT is basically the JJK equivalent to the Strength of Hundreds healing, but it's actually better since it can heal damage to the soul. Granted, once overuse of CT, CE, and/or RCT can weaken the rate by which one can heal. Sukuna's best durability feats come from surviving two separate hollow purples, which are imaginary masses composed of both the lapse and reverse applications of Limitless. Hollow Purple disintegrates everything it comes in contact with, turning a large portion of a city into rubble. The first Hollow Purple was amped by 200% of its normal output, which wiped out approximately 4 kilometers worth of buildings and objects in its path. Sukuna tanked the attack after reading the output of the attack late and only suffered damage to his arms, which quickly healed. The second Hollow Purple was fired in a roundabout way and its blast radius was unrestricted. This Hollow Purple was weaker than the first one, but Gojo did fire it after landing 3 black flashes, which would have increased his current performance by 60%. Sukuna surmised that it would kill him at close range since neither combatant was at full strength. Sukuna also tanked multiple punches from Gojo that are reinforced with cursed energy while using Lapse, which Hikari states is like taking a counterpunch even though they're normal blows. These punches should scale higher than the single strike Sukuna hit Yuji with after he took over Megumi's body, which easily sent him through a building while only having 16 fingers. Gojo even landed a black flash against the King of Curses, which would have amped his punch by the power of 2.5. As for endurance, I'm gonna go over most of the attacks Sukuna had to tank or heal from during the final arc. I also want to give you guys some perspective. Sukuna fought the Genjutsu High Sorcerers immediately after his fight with Gojo. They had near perfect intel on how most of his abilities worked, and backup plan after backup plan, in addition to a full month's worth of switch training in order to accelerate their growth. He was even impressed to the point he asked them what they did during the past month, and Yuta replied, "We cheated." Yuta also remarks that if it wasn't for his fight with Gojo, he would have wiped them out, and Sukuna adds that his cursed energy output was low and his reserves dropped by about half their overall amount, so he's not exactly fighting them at full strength either. To give you all an idea of how difficult it was to kill Sukuna, he took multiple attacks to the face, including a copied cleave from Yuji's shrine. Yuji spit blood on his face, which eventually erupted. Yuta ripped out his second tongue and cut off his left hand. He had a large portion of his face ripped off, got blasted with a maximum output Jacob's Ladder which destroys cursed objects, got stabbed from behind by the Soul Split Katana which damaged both his heart and soul, and up until this point he says he's having no trouble keeping up with Maki. He takes multiple slashing attacks from Kusakabe, who has an original program that allows him to attack anything that invades his domain automatically. He loses another arm while getting jumped by Yuji, Miguel, Laru, Chozo, and Maki, lost his foot to Yuji's newly awakened shrine. He tanked an incomplete hollow purple from Yuta, who took over Gojo's body. A second maximum output Jacob's Ladder blasts him, and up until this point he took 16 hits from Yuji, which targeted the boundary between both his and Megumi's souls in order to rip them apart, which not only lowered his cursed energy output but also dropped his physical control, making it harder for him to move. Of those 16 hits, 8 of those punches were also black flashes, which lowered his output even further, and he took all of this while suffering brain damage from Gojo's Unlimited Void and his 2 uses of RCT that healed his CT burnt out state. Even through all of that, Sukuna was capable of recovering his RCT after landing 2 black flashes against Todo and Angel. It took a total of 36 hits from Yuji, including a domain expansion that targeted Sukuna's soul with a dismantle. He also had assistance from Nobara, who hit Sukuna with a resonance, and Megumi, who slowed him down. Finally, Yuji had to land a 9th black flash in order to put down the King of Curses. This is gonna piss off a lot of you, but EMS Madara has no durability feats. I'm not kidding, there genuinely aren't any feats of him getting hit. Most of his durability feats come from his time as an Edo Tensei, where he does tank physical blows from Tsunade and A. As an Edo, his body would heal regardless, but there aren't many signs of damage from Tsunade's first kick against him when both she and A get teleported to the battlefield at light speed. If you think that his real body can tank Tsunade and A's attacks, then fair enough. However, we never really see him take direct hits before he gets Sage Mode, which would obviously improve his durability. And even then, Sasuke's blade showed the capacity to pierce through his arm, even though it didn't show any chakra imbuement. Tsunade did possess the ability to blast through a portion of Madara's body with a single punch, but this was a wood clone, so whether or not he could tank a hit is up for debate. In the final battle between himself and Hashirama, when they exchanged blows with their strongest attacks, Madara's Susanoo was stripped off. It protected him from Hashirama's Shinsu Senju, but he never took a direct hit. You can see that Madara at the end of their fight had less damage overall than Hashirama. The only things that were gone were his shoulder plates and armor, and his clothes didn't seem to have any damage on them, while his body did have scratch marks. Hashirama, on the other hand, was missing his headband, while part of his armor and sleeve were destroyed, and you can clearly see that Hashirama has either burn wounds or heavy damage on his left arm. Madara glazed the ever-living hell out of Hashirama during his fight with the 5 Kage, and even touted that he could heal without performing hand signs, and his healing surpassed Tsunade's medical ninjutsu. However, this changed once he saw the true nature of the mitotic regeneration 100 healings jutsu. By the end of their final battle, Hashirama showed no signs of healing, and they were both clearly exhausted. That makes me believe that Madara took less damage throughout their fight because he has no healing factor. Which is unfortunate because he died to a single sword stab. And before I get any comments saying that you can enhance the power of the sword with your chakra, that sword is not glowing. Every time a weapon is imbued with chakra, it's glowing or has some kind of chakra around it. They were both basically out of chakra. I do want to add that in both of their battles, where he did have EMS, Madara's chakra reserves did last about a period of at least 24 hours. I feel like it's important to show you that even though he does have extremely impressive durability feats, when it comes to the Susanoo, it's difficult to make an argument that his own body is so tough he can just tank any attack without suffering any damage, let alone Sukuna's slashes. Scaling his Susanoo's durability can be a bit difficult, especially if you go under the assumption that it's tougher than Sasuke's or Itachi's Susanoos. He was able to tank a massive Rasengan from Naruto. In the databooks, it stated that Jiraiya's Sage Massive Rasengan could carve away mountains, but the massive Rasengan that Madara blocked came from a shadow clone that was in base. I'm not sure if one could argue Naruto's base clone has a massive Rasengan that's as powerful as Sage Jiraiya's, but let's just just say that it is. Madara's Susanoo ribcage did block it momentarily, but he did ramp it up to a humanoid Susanoo in order to blow it away. High temperature heat, like Mei's lava-style jutsu, could also partially melt the humanoid Susanoo, and while it was melting, Ace punches amped by Inoki could also break the inner ribcage. A should be comparable to the Eight Tails Gyuki, who should have the capacity to easily wipe out mountains like the other tailed beasts, while using its tailed beast bomb. Now, I'm aware that Killer B was capable of wiping out a massive part of a forest with his Eight Tails Biju Twister, but I wouldn't use this as an exact metric since Jinchuriki are unquantifiably stronger than the lone-tailed beast. I think it's fair to at the very least put Madara's Susanoo ribcage within the mountain level tier. As for the perfect Susanoo, it could block a tailed beast bomb from the full 9 tails while guarding, and I'll talk about this a bit later. AP and DC can be difficult to gauge, especially when you don't go by calcs. As I've mentioned in my live streams, attack potency isn't reliant on destructive capacity, but destructive capacity is reliant on attack potency. In other words, you can have an attack that deals more damage than its maximum range may imply, but you can't destroy something without having the proper damage output to destroy it in the first place. When it comes to EMS Madara, there isn't a lot to go off of in regards to his low end. His fire-style jutsu, specifically the Majestic Destroyer Flame, was so intense it took approximately 6 to 7 water walls in order to extinguish the flame. His Dragon Flame Caterwall was capable of damaging Tsunade's arms after she knocked them away, heavily burning her. In terms of taijutsu, he can knock away several shinobi by simply running past them or knocking them into one another. He shows the capacity to easily take out most of, if not all of the platoon's ninjas in a single hit. His Susanoo blades can easily penetrate Tsunade's midsection, and his Yasaka Magatama can easily blast her across the battlefield. It also took a combination of Gaara's Sand and Inoki's Stone Golem to block it. The humanoid Susanoo did overpower the Kage, but it was more of a numbers advantage rather than the raw power of a single Susanoo, as Tsunade was capable of knocking them down and A could stop their attacks. Granted, they were the physically strongest Kage there. One thing I will make note of is that in this fight, Madara won't have the Susanoo clones since he specifically made them from wood clones and he's never shown the capacity to make shadow clone Susanoo. As for his full power, the perfect Susanoo, its best display of power happened during its debut where he demonstrated the ability to slash away the top of 2 mountains with the force of its blade unsheathing. Now, some of you may not believe me, but there really aren't that many displays of the perfect Susanoo's power, or at least when it comes to Madara's Susanoo. He reveals its power to the Kage. We see it in a flashback where he fights Hashirama, but it's turned into the Majestic Attire Susanoo, which would be more powerful than the perfect Susanoo alone. He uses it again against Hashirama in the War Arc, but there really aren't any concrete displays of power since they mostly clash off-screen. The 2 mountaintop cutting feet is pretty much the only thing one can go off of when it comes to its power, and I know some will say that it has the power to rival the Biju, however the term Biju doesn't give us the full picture. Kurama is by far the strongest of all the Biju, and it's the strongest by an extremely large margin. I'm not gonna say whether or not it's as strong as Kurama, but if its power is comparable to Kurama, why not just compare it directly to him? He did need Kurama in order to fight Hashirama alone. The reason why I bring this up is because many people argue that Kurama is planetary. This comes from the idea that there's a statement in the data book that specifically states Kurama has the power to turn the world to ash. Power scaling is all about interpretations, and depending on how one interprets certain statements or feats, they can get wildly different results, hence the universal Naruto meta I mentioned earlier. If this statement is taken in its most literal sense, then sure, Kurama is planetary and Madara would be as well through some kind of upscaling. However, I disagree with this because Kurama has never shown the capacity or feats to just straight up one-shot the planet. Especially since Kurama, with the Majestic Attire Susanoo, shot an enhanced tailed beast bomb that seemingly wiped out a large portion of land after crossing a body of water. Now, the fairest interpretation I could come up with is that Kurama can turn the surface of the world to ash over a period of time if it walked across the surface of the planet unimpeded. Unlike Kurama, the perfect Susanoo doesn't shoot giant nukes. Its attacks are at best reshaping the landscape, but I wouldn't say they're planetary, and the clash between both Hashirama and Madara resulted in the Valley of the End, which, might I add, we never see the full scope of, but it isn't actually that massive of a location, at least in my opinion. If I had to be honest, the perfect Susanoo being Biju level seems consistent if you consider that it did level some mountains and the other weaker Biju could blow them away with their tailed beast bombs. To be clear, I'm not saying it caps out at mountain level. When it comes to Sukuna, many people say that he caps out at city block level, and I disagree. In the volume release of JJK chapter 224, the end of the chapter states the city can't survive a showdown between both monsters. More so, Kenjaku states that what determines a special grade is the ability to single-handedly overthrow entire nations, and even says it's obviously true for Gojo. In addition, Meimei states that Gojo alone should be capable of easily killing everyone in the country. Now, to be fair, this would mean that, like my interpretation for Kurama, Gojo can't one-shot a country, but could wipe out every living thing over a period of time. And Sukuna would upscale from this since he's stronger. Not to mention that Kenjaku's statements would apply to all special grades, which would include the finger bearers, which Sukuna referred to as an insect. Sukuna's dismantle is capable of easily slicing straight through buildings. Even when his output was lowered by Yuji and his fight with Gojo, he could easily split apart an entire building through and through while fighting Maki. In his weaker Megumi form, while only carrying 16 fingers, he could punch Yuji through a building without issue. I'm gonna be honest, if we're talking brute force alone, Sukuna is more than likely physically stronger than Madara based on feats alone. His secondary slashing attack, Cleave, needs to make physical contact, but it can be adjusted to the target's toughness and cursed energy to cut them down in one fell swoop. Sukuna mentioned that Jujutsu High's members had increased their fundamental cursed energy reinforcement, which would include Yuji and Yuta. He mentions that he wouldn't be able to leave a fatal wound unless he made physical contact. He says they aren't as tough as Ryu Ishigori, who he previously tried to split into 3, but only left a single wound, which made Sukuna remark that he wasn't half bad, and yet he was still casually one-shot by Sukuna's Cleave. As for Malevolent Shrine, Sukuna would normally use a combination of both Cleave and Dismantle, but since Cleave specifically targets things with cursed energy, it won't be effective. Regardless, due to the nature of Sukuna's domain expansion, Dismantle will land its sure hit effect on everything that is an inanimate object, which Madara would count as within its 200-meter range. He can also undergo a binding vow that allows him to shorten the range of the domain to increase its output. Madara can level mountaintops, but Sukuna flattened everything within the 140-meter range of his domain expansion in Shibuya. If he prepares his ingredients with Cleave and Dismantle, he can open the furnace and call forth the Divine Flame. To go into detail, the thermobaric explosives scatter to every inch of the domain. The heat from the Divine Flame causes detonation, instantaneous high temperatures, shockwaves, decompression, and intense pressurization, which in turn kills all living things inside the domain. Finally, his most recent technique is the World-Cutting Slash. To use this technique, he needs to perform the Enma hand sign and direct the slash with his palm while chanting an incantation. Sukuna developed this technique in order to finish off Gojo by using Mahoraga's adaptation in order to create a slash that was unlike anything he had used before. A slash that specifically expands the target of his technique so that it cuts space, the entire world, and existence itself. As long as it exists within that space, that world, it will be severed, possibly making this his most dangerous technique. One last thing I should add is that if you use Dagon and Jogo as a reference to how powerful Sukuna's domain expansion may be, then look no further into their domain expansions. Dagon and Jogo create an island and a mountain respectively in an instant. While these structures are manifestations of their cursed energy, one could argue that the energy it takes to create said structures is indicative of its overall energy output potency. This is probably one of the most contentious forms of scaling for JJK as a whole. The inside structures of these domains don't exactly match the size of the outside barrier. However, the formation of a barrier technique's external appearance and its size never match what's on the inside. You can see this in the Gojo vs Sukuna fight, where Gojo was capable of shrinking down his domain's outer barrier to the size of a basketball, and yet inside the domain, you can see both characters fight without any restraint. This is no different in principle than any other domain expansion. Sukuna's domain is so far above Jogo's, even with only 16 fingers, that Jogo himself stated he would lose in a battle of domains. This would obviously upscale Sukuna's domain expansion far past mountain level and possibly even island level, which would also add credence to Sukuna being a country level threat, especially when you consider that Gojo was capable of tanking Jogo's domain expansion without any issue, but then got completely torn apart by Sukuna's malevolent shrine. Now, before I get into the actual fight, I want to go over one last thing. I often see in my comment sections that people like to bring up things such as experience or battle IQ, and how they think the characters would fight. So I decided to simply tackle that in this portion. In my opinion, experience is one of the most meaningless things that people can bring up in any versus battle, because almost every shonen provides examples time and time again of someone with a tenth of the experience of their opponent still surpassing them. It's one of those obvious things that is completely unquantifiable, entirely subjective, and it's no different when it comes to this fight. Madara's age is never explicitly stated throughout the entirety of Naruto. We can assume he's maybe 30 plus years old by the time he fights Hashirama, and the best that we can surmise is that he spent a majority of that time in war. As for Sukuna, we have no idea about anything that happened within the Heian era besides a couple of statements of the separate squads that tried to attack him. Either way, he clearly aged at some point in his life, since we know for a fact he was born as a baby. Moving on to their personality, and as I mentioned at the start of the video, it's one of the biggest factors when it comes to my argument for this video. Madara and Sukuna are both two sides of the same coin. I could go for another 5 to 10 minutes about how these two characters interact with their opponents and how their analytical abilities would apply to this battle, but honestly, as I've been writing this script, I'm like 13 pages in and I don't want to take up more of your time, so I'm just gonna come out and say it. While both Madara and Sukuna play with their food, of the two, Sukuna is more likely to go for the kill as early as possible. In every single example where Sukuna fights an individual, he immediately goes for the kill, and if it doesn't work, he goes for it again. When he talks about his nature, he says, if I see an eyesore, I kill it, and if it entertains me, I throw it a bone. But after he throws something a bone, he always goes for the kill anyway. A consistent starting move for him is to literally always go for the head. On the other hand, while Madara does play with his opponents, he takes it a lot farther. He could have killed the 5 Kage the entire time that they fought, and he likely could have captured Naruto if he just used this perfect Susanoo, but he never pulls out the technique unless his back is against the wall, or unless he's specifically fighting Hashirama. This is important because I genuinely do not think that Madara will ever pull out the perfect Susanoo on Sukuna unless he truly has no other option left. Meanwhile, Sukuna would drop a domain expansion on a finger bearer just for fun. If you ask me, out of the two, Sukuna is portrayed to be the more analytical combatant. Now, before you start typing in the comments, hear me out. During a majority of the war arc, where we get to see Madara fight his opponents, we don't really get to see that many examples of him identifying his opponent's strengths and weaknesses. He does say that Mei's lava-style jutsu isn't worth absorbing. He does make remarks on Tsunade's strength, Ei's speed, and the Kage's impressive defenses, and every now and then, he does compliment the Kage. However, he also looks down on them to such a degree that when they finally put him in a position where his back is against the wall, he simply overpowers them with the perfect Susanoo. Even when he thought he outplayed them with a wood clone Susanoo, Tsunade claimed that they forced him to substitute with his clone, and his response was to simply make more clones. We do see Madara realize that he needs Sage Mode in order to defeat Obito. By the time he does become the Ten Tails Jinchuriki, he immediately identifies that Naruto and Sasuke have gained 6 Paths Senjutsu and the Rinnegan respectively. However, he also declares that he already has both of these abilities and boldly claims this would be the final battle. This is important to note because he's quickly proven wrong and he has to immediately retreat in order to retrieve his second Rinnegan.
Okay, so change of plans. I realize that I made the section of Sukuna's analysis too short, and I know for a fact that a good number of you aren't going to actually look at the information that's on the screen, so I figured, you know what? Let me actually break it down for you, because I know some people are going to just say I'm downplaying Madara's intelligence and that I'm completely glazing how smart Sukuna actually is. In addition to him quickly breaking down the sorcerer's improvements when it came to cursed energy reinforcement, Sukuna quickly figures out that the blunt weapon Ino is using has Nanami's CT materialized into it. He figures out that Uiui's CT is teleportation off of a single glance, and that they're transporting the sorcerers to Shoko in order to treat the wounded. Thanks to Megumi's memories, he quickly realized their second plan and that Yuta's CT is copy in addition to what Yuji's role would be after he landed that first hit. He made a mental list of every single CT that Yuta can copy, and then went out of his way to break down every single improvement they displayed, which in turn impressed him with the rapid progression that the sorcerers had in such a short amount of time. He broke down the logic behind Maki's attempted backstab. He knew beforehand that Yuji could eventually wield Shrine, and then through a series of binding vows, which he's been abusing throughout the entire series, performed a domain expansion that maintained its utmost difficulty while his back was against the wall. He admits that Todo's intervention came at the worst possible time because he fights at his own pace, and quickly surmised that the new Vibra Slap Boogie Woogie would be practically impossible to adapt to, so instead he focused on a specific point in which he could accurately read the timing of the shifting positions. Granted, thanks to Mace Crow, Sukuna misread the situation, which allowed Yuji to land another Black Flash. When Gojo had seemingly returned, he immediately knew that it was Yuta who had copied Kenjaku's technique in order to take over his body. After Yuji lands a Soul Dismantle, Sukuna realizes that it's due to a binding vow and that it's more effective than a normal blow. After Angel blasts him with a Jacob's Ladder, he immediately goes for a counterattack, knowing no one else would be able to interfere. And just to be clear, all of this analysis comes after his fight with Gojo, which I could also break down, but the three big things to take away from that fight when it comes to Sukuna's analytical abilities are that he was the only person who figured out all of the mechanics behind Mahoraga's adaptation. He knew the risks behind Gojo's impromptu CT burnout reset technique after a single look, and he used Mahoraga's adaptation to develop a special slash that could bypass infinity. The only things he didn't account for were Yuji's punches breathing life back into Megumi's soul, and Nobara using his last missing finger for her resonance due to Yuta's misdirection, although he instantly knew where the attack came from as soon as it landed. There are plenty more examples I could bring up within the context of the earlier plot points of the series, but I think my point has been made. I genuinely think of the two Sukunas the more analytical combatant, and it's not even close, but I know that many of you are going to get upset if I don't say Madara is the smarter combatant, so to put it shortly, we'll just agree that both characters are in an equal level when it comes to combat analysis.
To wrap up everything I've said up until now, Sukuna and Madara should be relative in speed. When it comes to overall AP and DC, I'll give it to Madara strictly because of the perfect Susanoo. Even if one could argue that Malevolent Shrine is just as powerful, the fact is that the perfect Susanoo can level mountains with just the force of its slashes, while Malevolent Shrine is limited to a 200-meter radius. Sukuna should easily be physically stronger than Madara, at least by tangible feats alone, but Madara can always rely on his Susanoo ribcage at the very least to tank those punches. One could definitely argue Madara has at the very least an edge when it comes to speed because of all of the light speed attacks in Naruto. However, without any way of properly quantifying how much faster he would be, in addition to the lack of light speed dodging feats, I think just balancing things out makes things fair and simple. Madara's Susanoo should also give him a better defense than Sukuna's cursed reinforcement, but when it comes to his own ability to tank direct hits, Sukuna can easily outlast Madara because of RCT. So this is a battle where Madara can't afford to suffer any damage, especially when it comes to Sukuna's slashes. I almost forgot to talk about them, but their respective weapons Kumatoke and the Uchiha Gunbai are kind of useless. Kumatoke can release a torrent of lightning that Sukuna can use to set up his opponents for attacks, but the Sharingan invalidates this since Madara can predict the motion of his arms and should have the speed to always dodge the lightning. I say this in part because the manga didn't do a very good job in depicting the power of this cursed tool since he used it against the one guy that has natural electric resistances, but the anime may change my mind. As for the Gunbai, it can be used to reflect attacks back at the opponent by converting the chakra from their ninjutsu into wind nature transformations, which Sukuna obviously doesn't have. He can at the very least use it as a shield, until Sukuna slashes it. So, Who do I think wins this fight? I'm gonna be honest, because I've thought about this fight for months prior to even starting the necessary research, and I genuinely came to the following conclusion. If Madara takes a head-on slash from Sukuna while he's not at least bolstering himself with chakra, he straight up loses a limb or he dies, which leads me to my first possible win condition for Sukuna. Okay, so hear me out. I know this is already getting off to a wild start, but think about it just for a second. I looked through every piece of evidence that I could find in regards to the Sharingan. It grants many things, but it does not grant the ability to see changes in air pressure. I've looked through multiple sources, including the databooks, the fandom wiki, and even other videos that explain the Sharingan, and none of them imply that the user could see changes in air pressure, nor are there any feats that could help support this. Sukuna can send out slashes without moving a muscle. The Sharingan specifically allows the user to see their opponent's next move by picking up on the slightest flex in their muscles, like when it showed Sasuke the entire path Naruto was going to take just from seeing his muscles moving in real time. The Mangekyo Sharingan is said to be even more advanced than this, but again, it's never stated to allow the user to see changes in the atmosphere. Therefore, Madara cannot see Sukuna's slashes. I've seen people bring up that because Maki could see them, that Madara should be capable of doing it as well. But Madara isn't Maki, and she only has this ability because of her heavenly restriction. There is absolutely no line of reasoning I could come up with for Madara being capable of seeing Sukuna's slashes without equalizing the verses or straight up saying he can, because why not? I could see at the very start of the fight, if they even have any kind of dialogue, which in character they probably would, the moment Madara even remotely says anything that implies he's looking down on Sukuna, he'll just shoot out a slash that Madara can't see and likely take off his head. Sukuna is the type of character that will unironically cut you down even without making eye contact with you. If Madara has no way of knowing what Sukuna's abilities are, if he doesn't know that Sukuna can send out his attacks without even moving a muscle, and if he isn't preemptively amping whatever part of his body Sukuna chooses to slash, he straight up either loses a limb or loses his head. He wouldn't even know the slash is coming his way. I do think that's extremely boring, so for the sake of the argument, we'll instead say that Sukuna will perform some kind of hand motion and Madara will instinctively put up a Susanoo ribcage or use a clone substitution. He would likely use the hiding in surface jutsu to stab Sukuna from behind, but Sukuna would instinctively avoid it. Madara would follow up with a majestic destroyer flame, which Sukuna wouldn't expect, and he would tank the attack and recover using RCT. If he can tank an imaginary mass that wiped out about 4 kilometers worth of a city while only losing reinforced arms, then I think he can easily tank a large sea of flames even if he suffers initial burn wounds. Now that both have an idea of what the other is capable of, here's where things get complicated. If they go for hand-to-hand combat, I think both characters will have a clear advantage over one another. The Sharingan should allow Madara to notice every single one of Sukuna's following actions through inherent visual precognition, but Sukuna's extra pair of arms, larger frame, and cursed energy reinforcement might be able to balance things out. However, I would like to remind you that if Sukuna grabs either of Madara's arms or gets a hold of his midsection, he will instantly shred apart said body part with Cleave. Cleave adjusts itself to the opponent's durability, and while I'm sure one would try to argue that Madara would casually tank it, as I've mentioned earlier, he doesn't have the necessary tangible durability feats to imply such a thing. The winner of this exchange shouldn't really matter, because once Sukuna decides to drop a domain expansion, the fight should end unless Madara has the perfect Susanoo. The Susanoo ribcage alone shouldn't be capable of blocking Malevolent Shrine's sure-hit effects, since it targets everything within the domain, and both Madara and the ribcage might be treated as separate entities. When Sasuke fought against the 5 Kage, Mei performed the Skill Mist Jutsu, which created a corrosive mist that affected both himself and the Susanoo. While it does provide a surrounding defense, it doesn't keep everything out. The Jujutsu sorcerers describe Sukuna's open domain as accumulating water without a container or using software without any hardware. I don't think it's disingenuous of me to say that if Mei is capable of burning Sasuke because she changed the pH balance of the mist in a contained space, then Sukuna should be capable of tearing Madara to shreds even through the Susanoo ribcage. I'm sure some would say that if Gojo was capable of surviving Malevolent Shrine, then Madara should easily tank it, even if the slashes hit him, but there's a couple of factors that should be taken into consideration first. Unlike Gojo, Madara doesn't have any idea what domain expansion is and how exactly it would damage him. He would have to preemptively bolster his entire body with chakra to tank the countless slashes that would hit him instantly. Gojo only survived because he used RCT at full throttle in addition to cursed energy reinforcement, and he still had the surface of his skin ripped to shreds, which Madara wouldn't be able to heal. In addition, the output of the slashes should be much greater than the ones Sukuna used to both tear Mahoraga to shreds and reduce Shibuya into a flattened plane, since the range of the domain was extremely small by comparison. Gojo also performed a simple domain and later on Falling Blossom Emotion in order to further weaken the output of the slashes so that his RCT could heal even more of the damage, and while all of this was happening, Sukuna could apply pressure by forcing him into close combat. All of this is to say that I don't think Madara has the necessary tools to tank Malevolent Shrine if he doesn't at the very least have a humanoid Susanoo to block out the initial slashes, and even then he would have to figure out that he needs to destroy the shrine itself before the Susanoo breaks apart. Even if you think that the humanoid Susanoo can tank the slashes, it will eventually be worn down. I feel like you have to give so much benefit of doubt for Madara to be capable of surviving Malevolent Shrine, especially with how likely Sukuna is to drop it early into the fight. I believe that the first domain expansion Sukuna uses against Madara will more than likely kill him, but as I said at the start of the video, Madara does have Izanagi. In the event that Madara doesn't properly defend against Malevolent Shrine, or that his humanoid Susanoo can't tank it, he may have enough time to make the necessary hand signs in order to activate Izanagi and rewrite his own death at the cost of one of his eyes. I need to talk about Izanagi for a second because depending on what the limitations of the jutsu are, the result may heavily vary. You see, Izanagi is a jutsu based on the creation of all things technique. It turns imagination into reality. In other words, for a few seconds, the user can put reality into a genjutsu so that they can rewrite their own deaths. The injured self fades away while the non-injured self materializes themselves in their place. According to the 4th data book, the duration of the jutsu changes depending on the user's power capacity. The exact time frame isn't quantifiable since Danzo could have Izanagi active for an entire minute per Sharingan, effectively making him immortal for 10 minutes, and Obito could survive Konan's 600 billion paper bombs for 10 minutes. But the difference between them and Madara is that they have Hashirama cells. A combination of both Uchiha and Senju power is necessary to maximize the capabilities of the jutsu, which this version of Madara can't exactly do due to the lack of Hashirama cells. In addition, while the duration may be anywhere between 1 to 10 minutes for Madara, once he is rematerialized, he instantly loses sight in one of his eyes. The Izanagi seems to be a one-time thing per use, even if the time limit itself isn't used up. We saw this with Danzo where the eyes on his arm closed after every use regardless of the full duration of the jutsu. One more thing I'd like to add is the respawn distance of the jutsu. In the 2 separate instances where we see this jutsu being utilized mid-combat, the user respawns within a certain distance of their dead body. I'm sure the user has some level of control over where they may respawn, but the issue in this specific fight is that Malevolent Shrine has a maximum range of 200 meters. Against Sasuke, Danzo kept respawning within a few meters of his dead body, however, as Obito put it, his Izanagi was incomplete. Meanwhile, against Konan, Obito respawned an unquantifiable distance away. Even if the distance is over 200 meters, since he was falling continuously, his Izanagi would arguably be better than Madara's since he does have Hashirama cells. There really isn't any definitive evidence one could use to say that Madara could respawn outside of the 200 meter radius, and if he does respawn inside the domain's range, he would have to immediately activate his Susanoo or else it'll just happen again. I know it sounds like I've been glazing Sukuna this entire time, but I want you to look at it from this perspective. Of the two, Sukuna is the only one that has a way of healing themselves consistently since none of Madara's jutsu can definitively kill him in a single hit because of both RCT and CE reinforcement. He only has fire-style jutsu to work with and his Susanoo. The Yasaka Magatama couldn't blast through the sand and stone golem defense formation, and Tsunade, who essentially has RCT, could survive a direct blow to the midsection. If Sukuna could survive a 200% amped Hollow Purple or an impromptu Hollow Purple in a weakened state, I don't think it's an outlandish claim to say that he can survive Yasaka Magatama. Even if Madara does stab Sukuna through the heart, he can keep it beating through CE reinforcement and fight him without issue. In addition, of the two, Sukuna is the only one that can ramp himself up with black flashes for a 20% increase to his current maximum potential per black flash. And if he views Madara even remotely like Maki, he may have something to prove and will start landing them back to back like he did against the Genjutsu sorcerers, with the total being 7. If Madara does survive Malevolent Shrine through Izanagi, or he can perform so much pressure with his clones, Susanoo, or his fire style, that Sukuna's RCT starts to slow down, he can always recover it by landing black flashes. As for the CT burnout state that happens after performing domain expansion, he can use RCT to heal out the burnt out technique by using cursed energy to destroy the part of the brain where the technique is engraved and then healing it with RCT. The only reason he didn't perform this against the sorcerers after his fight with Gojo is because he already had brain damage from Unlimited Void, so it would have been too risky. Sukuna unironically has the better toolkit when it comes to killing the opponent as quickly as possible. As a reminder, his slashes are invisible. If he gets a hold of Madara in any way, he's losing a limb or he's losing his life. His domain expansion can likely bypass the Susanoo ribcage, which is his most common form of defense, and I genuinely believe that it can quickly break apart the humanoid Susanoo with relentless innumerable slashes, especially if he lowers the range of the domain to increase its damage output. Even if Madara identifies the shrine itself as the source of the slashes and destroys it, Sukuna can always use RCT to quickly reset his burnt out technique and do it all over again. I don't think Madara walks away from this fight without at the very least using Izanagi once, and that's under the assumption that he doesn't get his head immediately chopped off at the start of the fight, since again, there's no argument for him having the capacity to see the slashes in the first place. Also, one more thing, just cause I couldn't find a chance to mention it anywhere else, but if we're talking raw firepower, and I do mean firepower, Sukuna outright beats Madara in this regard. When discussing the Divine Flame versus any of Madara's fire style jutsu, I think it's blatantly obvious who comes out on top. The explanation for the Furnace and Divine Flame go into a level of detail that outright put any of Madara's fire style jutsu to shame, since the best one could argue is that he can spit out flames of various sizes and shape, with his most iconic technique being the Majestic Destroyer Flame, which required several water style users combining multiple water walls in order to cancel it out, and the jutsu being used in order to burn down the surrounding trees Madara surrounded the 5 Kage with. By comparison, the Divine Flame could cover every inch of the domain Sukuna used in Shibuya and essentially turned it into a massive exploding pressure cooker that the narrator stated would kill all things inside. The massive torrent of fire and shockwaves, coupled with basically guaranteed damage since everything inside the domain is covered in explosive cursed energy, leads me to the conclusion that if these two decide to go band for band with their fire techniques, Sukuna would come out on top. However, the fact that Sukuna has to prepare his ingredients first, meaning he has to land both Cleave and Dismantle in order to use this technique, makes me wonder how exactly he would go about this during the fight, so I didn't factor this ability when thinking about how a fight between the two would go. Since Madara wouldn't be targeted with Cleave within Malevolent Shrine due to a lack of cursed energy, Sukuna would have to land it directly, which I already said would result in him losing an arm or his life. In addition, if anyone doubts the power of the Furnace, you should consider that he used this very technique to burn down Jogo, who was a curse born from humanity's fear of volcanoes. He used it again against Mahoraga in order to instantly one-shot it, like how Gojo did with Hollow Purple, and the narrator called this his ultimate move. Okay, so now that I got all of that out of the way, let's talk about how Madara can actually win this fight. I genuinely think that the perfect Susanoo might unironically be way too much for most of Sukuna's toolkit to handle if you don't think that the Malevolent Shrine has the capacity to damage it via the Jogo/Dagon scaling. The sword alone, if it tags Sukuna, would more than likely kill him since it'll likely damage his body beyond RCT's healing capabilities. I don't think I can make any arguments that could support Sukuna tanking a direct hit without at least suffering massive damage, especially since the force of its sword slash as it unsheathes can split two mountains, and a direct hit would likely be even more powerful. The perfect Susanoo is so tough it's capable of tanking a tailed beast bomb from Kurama while in a weaker state, and it took an entire barrage of 1,000 punches from the Shinsu Senju just to tear it off the Ninetales, leaving Madara virtually unscathed. I don't think I can necessarily make an argument that the Divine Flame can blast right through it. Either way, I don't want to go through the hassle of trying to convince anyone that the attack could even do it. The one thing I will say is that I'm not exactly sure if the perfect Susanoo can attack with a light speed sword slash, since there aren't any statements or tangible feats that would at least support this idea. I'm not saying its sword swing isn't fast, only that there isn't any definitive evidence that it's that fast. Under the parameters that I've set up for this fight, and under the assumption that this fight would go down at least somewhat like how I've been describing it up until now, if Madara is forced to use Izanagi and he does respawn outside of the range of Malevolent Shrine, I genuinely don't doubt that at that point he would view Sukuna as a big enough threat that he would immediately go for the perfect Susanoo and use the force of its blade unsheathing to destroy the shrine. Now, just to be clear, even under the assumption that the Susanoo's sword swing is as fast as Madara's own combat speed, Sukuna does have one ace up his sleeve that can still earn him a win: the world-cutting dismantle. I would have made this video regardless of whether or not Sukuna would lose, but the fact that there is a legitimate argument that he could win is what prompted me to go as in-depth as possible, especially since arguing that Madara Uchiha would lose any cross-verse fight is always an uphill battle because of the fan base's obvious reactions. The world-cutting dismantle cuts through everything within the target's range as long as it exists within that space, regardless of whether or not you believe that the perfect Susanoo is so tough that no attack could ever damage it. The fact is, if Sukuna fires it directly at the forehead gem that Madara stands in, he's going to die. As he described after his fight with Gojo, everything that exists within the target's range is going to be severed. No defense is going to prevent this attack from landing because Madara exists within that very space. I'm sure some would try to argue that the range of the attack isn't far enough for him to reach the forehead of the Susanoo. However, one thing I've neglected to mention during the entirety of this fight is that Sukuna can just kick off the air itself in order to gain height. You know, that one thing Might Guy could only perform while under the effects of the 8th Gate of Death. As I've mentioned earlier, if one argues under the assumption that the beam Kashimo fired at Sukuna is at the very least as fast as his EM wave attack, then the world-cutting dismantle is light speed, alongside Madara's lack of mobility, especially while inside the Susanoo, would mean that he would get tagged by this attack, especially if he's certain that the perfect Susanoo can tank all of his other slashes. The way I like to see this exchange is that as Madara forms the perfect Susanoo, Sukuna chants the world-cutting slashes incantation, and they both fire their final attack as the screen fades to white and the outcome of the winner is left up to you, the viewer. This is probably the most difficult fight I've ever had to construct an argument for. It's extremely hard to formulate an argument, especially against a character like Madara Uchiha, not because he's so overpowered that any character in fiction would have a tough time combating him, more so because the fan base can get very defensive. The purpose of this fight, at least for me, is to challenge the idea that a character like Madara can lose a fight against a character from a weaker verse, especially if one is capable of constructing a comprehensive argument. He's not this infallible, unstoppable force of nature that can't lose under any circumstance. I do find it interesting that for many, this is the conclusion that they've reached because Kishimoto did a wonderful job at depicting a character that seems nigh invincible flaw within his story. Madara straight up looks strong and almost perfect throughout the entirety of Naruto. However, his biggest flaw is the fact that if your name isn't Hashirama Senju, he's not pulling out the perfect Susanoo at the start of a fight. I got into power scaling about 7 or 8 years ago, and Naruto was the first series where I tried to learn its scaling, mostly because at the time it was my favorite series. Trust me when I say I was one of those Madara glazers who genuinely thought he could never lose a versus battle. Hell, at the time I tried to argue that he could beat any form of Aizen because he could drop meteors on top of him and his perfect Susanoo could easily wipe out mountains, whereas Aizen couldn't even destroy a large hill. Obviously, I don't think that anymore, as I've learned to scale, come to my own conclusions, and as I've gotten older, I came to the realization that the Naruto-verse isn't as overpowered or as indomitable as many people would still try to argue to this very day. Does that mean I think any of those people are wrong? Not at all. Scaling is all about interpretation, but more importantly, it's all about having fun. If you think Naruto and Kaguya are universal, that's cool with me. If you think Madara outright curb stomps Sukuna negative difficulty with just the fireball jutsu, that's just your opinion. After all, it's my opinion that Sukuna has an extremely good chance at killing Madara because his toolkit can counter most of Madara's offensive and defensive options. All of this ultimately comes down to how each and every one of us interprets the given information and what ultimately makes the most sense to us. But anyway, I've been yapping for over an hour. Thank you all so much for watching. I would really appreciate it if you guys would like and subscribe. If you guys enjoyed this long form analysis, let me know down in the comments. I will catch you all in the next video. Peace out.